So we'll take a closer look at the non-vascular plants now. That's the liverworts, the hornworts, and the true mosses. Remember I said they're oftentimes referred to just collectively as the bryophytes without a capital B as well, because they share a lot of characteristics. They look really similar. They're really small in size. They tend to be limited to very moist environments, as we'll talk about. And they have really similar reproductive cycles. So even though there are the three distinct groups, we won't actually distinguish them very much for this class. The modern day non-vascular plants are probably the most like the very first land plants. So they have these adaptations to life on land. And we'll focus specifically on their life cycle, their reproductive cycle. And how it's different from the early algae or from the algae relatives. Advance here. There we go. So again, kind of taking our focus into the life cycles of these organisms. The Charophycean algae, remember these are the complex streptophyte algae that are related to land plants, have a zygotic life cycle. This is a life cycle that has a really short-lived diploid zygote and never has a stage that's multicellular and diploid. Whereas land plants, including the bryophytes, will have a sporic life cycle with alternation of generations. So there will be the haploid gamete-producing gametophyte generation and the diploid spore-producing sporophyte generation. And I just want to reiterate that these are both multicellular. So I'm going to add that term here. So there's a multicellular sporophyte that makes spores and a multicellular gametophyte that makes gametes. And this is going to be different than the algae. So let's take a look at that algae life cycle. So they have a multicellular haploid gametophyte form. These can generate eggs and sperm. So the gametophyte generates eggs and sperm. That allows for fertilization. So the sperm gets to the egg and the egg is in the gametophyte. And so once fertilization has occurred, you have a diploid zygote. There it is inside of that tissue. But it is single-celled. It's not multicellular because we're talking about the algae. Okay. And so that single-celled zygote will go through meiosis. If you take one cell and you divide it with meiosis, and that's a diploid cell, remember you will get 4 haploid cells. And the cells that are produced are spores. So per zygote, you're going to get 4 spores. That's it. Okay? So that means each sort of reproductive event or fertilization produces just 4 offspring. That's the top amount that can be produced. And then those spores can go out and germinate and become 4 possible new gametophytes. Okay, so that's why I'm saying 4 spores equals 4 offspring. Those spores become new gametophytes. But again, the max is 4 because you only get a single-celled zygote. Whereas, as we're going to see in plants, this stage is multicellular, and you can have several cells that go through meiosis. And for every cell that goes through meiosis, you can get 4 haploid spores. Therefore, in plants, you can get many more offspring produced from one reproductive event. So we'll take a closer look here at the gametophyte and the sporophyte. So the gametophyte, again, is this multicellular haploid tissue. So it's multicellular, and it's haploid, and it will make haploid gametes. The gametophyte is produced by mitosis, so it's going to go, a spore will go through mitosis many times. Sorry, I'm writing backwards here, many times to produce a gametophyte. So gametophytes make gametes, but they come from spores, so a little bit confusing there. Within the gametophyte tissue, there will be places or specialized structures called gametangia, and that's where the actual gametes will be made. And There's sort of the female and male versions of that, Antheridia and Archegonia. The Antheridia are gametangia that make sperm, and the Archegonia are gametangia that make an egg. So I'm just going to write a little bit more here. So a spores will develop by mitosis into multicellular gametophytes. And then within the gametophytes, there are gametangia, and within those gametangia, there's a maturation process that will produce either egg or sperm. The egg will be produced by maturation in Archegonia, and the sperm will be produced through maturation in the Antheridia. So maturation just means a changing from one cell type to another cell type without having mitosis or meiosis necessarily, okay? And the egg and the sperm, again, are forming in the Antheridia and the Archegonia, and then eggs can find sperm, and that's fertilization. That fertilization will yield a zygote, and then that zygote is going to go through mitosis as well, and it's going to produce the sporophyte. Okay, and we'll talk more about the sporophyte in a second, but I want to look at this picture here. So this is a picture of one of these liverworts, and so what we have here is a gametophyte tissue. This sort of lettucey looking stuff is all gametophyte tissue, and we can't see them, but there might be little pockets within this gametophyte tissue that are Archegonia or Antheridia. So this might be Archegonia, this might be Antheridia, an Antheridium. So we have these little pockets within the gametophyte tissue that are specialized for gamete production. So when fertilization occurs, it occurs in an Archegonium. So this one here maybe is an Archegonium. The fertilization occurs there because the sperm have to swim to the egg. So a little sperm has to get over to this egg. And so it can come from this plant or from a different plant, but it has to get to the sperm through water. So notice the term swim here. So that process is going to require water on the surface, in the environment, okay, for that sperm to swim to that Archegonium. And then out of that Archegonium will grow a sporophyte. So see these little structures here? Those are sporophytes that have grown out of Archegonia because the zygote forms within the gametophyte tissue, and then the sporophyte grows up out of the gametophyte tissue. So the sporophyte actually is still attached to the gametophyte tissue. So the sporophytes are actually totally dependent on the gametophyte tissue. This is called matrotrophy. The zygotes remain sheltered and fed within the gametophyte tissue. Matrotrophy means to feed off the mother. So the sporophytes are actually getting all their nutrients from the gametophyte tissue as they grow. So all land plants are embryophytes. That means they have embryos that feed off of nutrients from the mother, okay? And how exactly that happens will be a little bit different in different types of plants. In the non-vascular plants, it's this direct feeding off of the gametophyte tissue. The gametophyte tissue is the one that's carrying out photosynthesis. So the gametophyte tissue is photosynthetic. The sporophyte tissue is not photosynthetic. So it has to feed off of the gametophyte. So these are sporophytes growing out of the gametophyte tissue. Here at the tip of these sporophytes are sporangia. So we see that term here, sporangia. And so this is the area where spores form. So the whole structure is a sporophyte. The sporangia are where the spores form. So the sporophyte tissue, so we have our sporophyte now. And then within the sporangia, we will get meiosis. The sporophyte is diploid, so when meiosis occurs, there it is, meiosis, we're going to get haploid cells that are spores. So the spores will be released from the sporangia. The spores are coated in a tough material called sporopolleninin, and that helps make the spores really resistant to drying out and to other damage. So these spores can actually come out into the environment, and they can wait in the environment for conducive conditions. So they can kind of get blown by the wind or hit by rain, or they just get scattered on the soil. And then when conditions are favorable, they can grow into a new gametophyte. Because remember, gametophytes spores are going to grow into gametophytes. Okay, so let's take a look at the figure that's putting these all together into a simplified version of this life cycle. So we have, let's start here, we have spores. These spores go through mitosis to develop into a gametophyte. The gametophyte is haploid because the spores are haploid, the gametophyte is haploid. Within the gametophyte tissue, you have archegonia and antheridia. So within those structures, the antheridia and the archegonia, you get maturation. So some of those cells will mature into an egg. Remember, they're already haploid, so we don't need meiosis. This haploid cell matures into an egg, or haploid gametophyte cells mature into sperm. Sperm have to have water to swim to the egg. That leads to fertilization. Fertilization produces the diploid zygote. And then here's where we have the big difference from algae. Instead of having that single zygote go into meiosis, it actually goes into mitosis, copies, and makes a diploid multicellular sporophyte. So this big structure. Now, some areas of this structure will go through meiosis in the sporangia. And for all of the cells that do that, you'll get more spores. So instead of having just 4 spores produced from that single zygote, you get hundreds and hundreds of spores produced from a multicellular sporophyte. And so that's why it's an evolutionary advantage compared to the algae life cycle.